First Kings chapter 2 is where we'll be studying together tonight. We're in the third week of our study. The first week we looked at an introduction to the books of First and Second Kings and tried to orient ourselves with what we're going to be studying together. And then in chapter 1 last week, we saw that Solomon is put upon the throne, even though there are some inner workings, and Adonijah tries to usurp the throne and seize the throne before David is actually gone and before a big decision by David is made public. And so Adonijah thinks he can simply seize the throne, believing that since he is the oldest living son of David, that it should rightly go to him in his mind, which he will even speak of again here in chapter 2 tonight. And so, but in the process of things, David uh, organizes a coronation for Solomon. And in the midst of Adonijah trying to work a scheme, news reaches him that that scheme has failed. And so, where we pick up tonight in 1 Kings chapter 2, David is on his deathbed. We've already seen him as the book opens as an old man who is losing the vitality of life. And now he's on his deathbed and he gives a final charge to Solomon. And so this chapter breaks into two parts. So you've got the first 12 verses dealing with David's final charge to Solomon and then the record of his death and burial. And then the second, a larger portion from 13 to the end of the chapter, to about verse 46, I believe, is where we have Solomon following the advice of David and dealing with some of the individuals that David has warned him about. And this covers at least a span of 3 years, because we get to the individual named Shimei. And of course, he makes an oath with Solomon and he observes and is faithful to that oath for about 3 years, and then he violates it, which leads to his death. And so this chapter covers a pretty good little picture of time. And so as we think about this chapter, let's take the first section to begin with in verses 1 through 12. And this section actually breaks into two specific sections. The first 4 verses, David focuses and talks to Solomon about the future. Okay, he talks to him about the future. And as he talks to him about the future, it is spiritually focused. And so he talks to him, number 1, about the future, and number 2, it's a spiritual focus. And the second half of this section, verses 5 through 12, he talks to him about the past, individuals that need to be dealt with because of things that were done in the past. And the focus here is political in its nature. Also, I think you can make an argument it does have some religious background to it, but it seems and feels more political in its nature, about solidifying the kingdom under Solomon's reign. And so as we think about this, let's begin with David on his deathbed speaking to Solomon. Chapter 2, verse 1, when David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. Now, first of all, he begins with this closing speech, which we've gotten used to when we walk through the Old Testament. You think about, for example, the closing speech of Isaac to his sons, or excuse me, Jacob to his sons in Genesis 48 and 49, or the closing speech of Moses in Deuteronomy 31, or the closing speech of Joshua in Joshua chapter 23, the closing speech of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 12. We see this here with David. We're going to see it we saw it with Jesus when we studied John together in our previous study, chapters 13 through 17, his farewell speech. You see it again in Acts chapter 20 with Paul's farewell speech to the Ephesian elders, and it could be argued even in 2 Timothy as he is writing his final letter, his farewell speech, so to speak, to his young son in the faith, Timothy. And so that's what's happening here. David is getting ready. Now he says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. It's an expression of dying, because all men will die, obviously with the exclusion of those people who are alive at the second coming of Jesus. But if you were to take the number of people that will be alive for that event versus all of the people who have gone before and have died, it's very safe to say the way of all the earth, the majority, the normative way of all the earth. And so he says to him in this process, be strong and show yourself a man. Now, what's interesting is a lot of times when a father will go out of town and he has an older son, or a son who is a little bit older in age, I should say, he will say to him something like this: while I'm gone, you're the man of the house. Yeah, I expect you to take care of things and to watch over certain things because I can't be here. Now, that's not necessarily what David has in mind here. Sometimes when you get into the definition of manhood, we have to be careful that we don't allow cultural definitions of manhood to define manhood. As Christians, our view has to be focused biblically. And so we have to focus on biblical manhood. And thankfully, there's been a lot of discussion over the last decade or so, and a lot of books have been written concerning biblical manhood and the need to recover what that means. So, what does David mean, though, when he tells Solomon to be strong and to show himself a man? Well, in verse 3, he describes what that looks like. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do wherever you turn. So, what does it mean to be strong and to show yourself a man? It means to submit yourself to God. It is to do what man was created to do, and that is to be submissive to his creator. We cannot, and there's nothing wrong with this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with men being handy, with men being hard workers. Those are all things that are commendable and admirable. But if we define manhood on those terms, those are very low bars of expectation and don't even deserve to be mentioned. If that's all that a person has, if that's all that a man has, then is he really a man according to God's eyes? Is he living up to God's role for the man if he's only doing those things? Because here he says, a man is showing himself to be a man only when he submits himself to God. That was God's original intention for man. And so that's what he's telling Solomon. Submit yourself to God and do this. And in verse 4, he says that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke to me, that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all of their heart and with all of their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Now, this is obviously a reference to 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 16, the statement for their obedience with this promise that God makes to David in this particular context of 2 Samuel 7. And so what's going on here is very interesting, because he's defining manhood for us as submission to God, but he's also impressing upon the mind of Solomon that just because you're a king, it does not mean that you are a law to yourself. So many kings have treated their position as if they were a law to themselves. They answered to no one. And God, in Deuteronomy 17, as he gave the rules for what a king would be like, he anticipated that they were going to ask for a king. 1 Samuel 8 didn't catch him off guard. He said, but when that time comes, I've got some requirements for this king. And one of the fundamental requirements of that king that take the latter part of that section in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 through 20, the king is to take and make himself, in his own handwriting, a copy of the law of Moses, that he might read it and keep it and obey it all the days of his life, and to remember not to lift himself up against his people. That he's not a law to himself, that there is a king that is far superior to him, and that's God. He was king over Israel long before whatever king steps into this position began, and he will be king over Israel long after this king is gone. And so David is encouraging him to do that and to not abuse his powers. And David understands the horror that can come upon yourself and upon your people when you abuse your power. It happened with Uriah. It happened with the numbering of the people in 2 Samuel 24. And so he's encouraging him and pointing him toward the future by saying, submit yourself to God and things will go well for you in your service. Now he gets to some more practical matters. Now, when you read a number of different commentators, it's quite interesting that a lot of them, and we saw this some last week, some people wanted to say that Bathsheba and Nathan and Solomon were pulling some underhanded tricks to try and get Solomon to the throne. But the only problem with that is you have to deny other passages, like in the Chronicles, where the wording is very clear that God had chosen Solomon. And so that I say that to say they repeat that process here. They try to make it look like that David is insecure and he's just seeking revenge through his son, and that Solomon is doing this because he's insecure and he doesn't want anybody taking the throne from him. I don't think that's at all what Solomon is doing. I don't think that has anything to do with what David is telling him here. He is dealing with people that were involved in the rebellion of Adonijah and even the rebellion of Absalom. If you can go back that far, one individual was involved in that rebellion. Not so much in the rebellion, but what he said as the rebellion was taking place. He's talking to him about things that need to be done. You have to remember, as a king, it is his job to make sure that justice is upheld. And when people go against the will of God, when people go against and fight against the government, as these individuals were, that God had ordained that Solomon would sit upon this throne, they have to face justice. And Solomon is the chief executor of that justice. And so he's going to give him these words. Moreover, verse 5, you also know that Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in time of peace for the blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt of his waist and on the sandals of his feet. And so Joab, of course, was the leader, the captain of his army. He was also complicit with David in the murder of Uriah the Hittite, 2 Samuel 11. But he was also complicit and murdered Abner and murdered Amasa, 2 Samuel. He murdered Abner in 2 Samuel chapters 2 and 3. You can read about that. He murdered Amasa in 2 Samuel chapter 20, not under the order of David, but of his own selfish ambition. And when you study the life of Joab, he has his own agenda. He uses his, or I should say, he misuses his position to fulfill his own agenda. And so he has killed people, not in times of war, but in times of peace, and put bloodshed upon him. And so when you see the image of he's putting on blood of war on the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet, he puts that on like it's his garment. He wears injustice. He embraces injustice in the way that he avenges people. He seeks vengeance as opposed to meting out justice. And so he warns Solomon. He says this: act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Sheol being a reference to the grave. That is, don't let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Don't let him die a normal, natural death. He's got to face punishment for what he's done. Now, part of the backdrop to this may be that in 2 Samuel 21, there's an issue that's taking place in Israel, and some of the sons of Saul have to be killed to avenge a previous injustice of Saul. And so it could be that David is also looking down that line saying, I know what can happen when you don't shore up injustices. And this man has blood on his hands, and there is injustice in the land, and that injustice must be addressed. Otherwise, it could have far-reaching circumstances for our ruling house in Israel and for the nation of Israel. And so he's telling him to address what's going on with Joab. Then in verse 7, and this is a more positive situation, but deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table, for with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And so Barzillai was an old man at the time of Absalom's rebellion. So he's telling him, embrace him. 2 Samuel 17, he meets them. David tries to show him kindness in return in 2 Samuel 19 when he's returning to Jerusalem from Absalom's rebellion. And so he's saying, let them eat at your table. Now, you remember David had done this with the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And so in essence, he's saying, put them on, take care of them in our family, make them a part of our family, let them eat at our table, and financially care for them and make sure that every one of their needs are met, because they made sure my needs were met in a time of specific need in my life. And so David wants to make sure that this man and his family are also taken care of. Then he turns his attention to Shimei. Now, Shimei is the descendant, or I shouldn't say, he's not the descendant of Saul, but he's of the same family line of Saul, is of the tribe of Benjamin. And when David was fleeing from Absalom, In 2 Samuel 16, Shimei curses David. So it gets so out of hand. Now, the curse is more than just using foul language as we think of it. The curse was to call down the curse of God upon an individual. It's far more serious than we would think of as just saying what we might consider to be a cuss word. It's far more serious than that. Not that cussing is okay, but it's far more serious than that, far more involved in that. And so he's hurling curses and insults at David. And one of David's mighty men actually looks to David and says, "Do you want me to go take his head off?" And David said, "Absolutely not. That's not who we are." And so it's now time to deal with him. It says, "He is the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim." A grievous curse. Now, what Shimei did was against the law of God. Exodus 22 and verse 28. You were not supposed to curse the ruler of your people. As a matter of fact, later when we get to 1 Kings 21, the way they get in Naboth's vineyard is some people testify that he cursed the king. And so the cursing of a king was a capital offense. And so he says this, "But when he came down to me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword." Talking about 2 Samuel 19 when he's returning. "Now, therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man, and you will know what you ought to do with him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol." He deserves the punishment that's going to come upon him. And so shoring up the scales of justice with him. So those are David's final words to Solomon about the future, a religious focus, about the past with a political focus, also with religious overtones, but more political, governmental affairs of things that need to be addressed. Two individuals to deal with individually. In a negative sense, they need justice meted out to them, and another to be dealt with in a positive sense. Then we're told in verse 10, "Then David slept with his fathers." He died, "and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established." So David is sleeping with his fathers, and he's buried. Acts chapter 2 and verse 29, that's a point that Peter makes very well when he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. He quotes a psalm that David wrote and says, "I'm going to tell you that David is dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. We can go see it if we want to." And his point is David's not talking about himself in the words of the psalm. He must be talking about somebody else. And I'm telling you, he's talking about Jesus. And so you see that. And then it's called the city of David because Jerusalem didn't come under the control of the people of Israel until David. 2 Samuel chapter 5, he had the city conquered. And so he reigned for 40 years, 7 of those years at Hebron. You remember at the opening of 2 Samuel, the kingdom is still somewhat split. Ishbosheth is reigning, one of the descendants of Saul, one of the sons of Saul. He's reigning at that particular time. And eventually things get turned over, and the kingdoms and the other parts of the nation that are not under the control of David come to him, and the whole nation is reunited again under his reign. And so then he spends 33 years in Jerusalem. And so it says, "So Solomon sat down on the throne of David his father." He's king, and his kingdom was firmly established. That is, there's not really a lot of threats. The transition has succeeded and gone smooth. The promise of God has, of course, proven to be true, 2 Samuel 7. And so Solomon is established. And this is going to come up again at the end of this next section. So now we're introduced to, after the death and the funeral of David, we're introduced to Solomon's interactions with the individuals involved in the rebellion. So this is what happens, verse 13. "Then, after the death of David, then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and she said to him, 'Do you come peacefully?' He said, 'Peacefully.'" Remember, she already knows what has happened last time. Is this going to be a repeat? We're going to have another underhanded issue. He says he's coming peacefully. He's not. It's another underhanded issue. So then he said, "I have something to say to you." She said, "Speak." He said, "You know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel fully expected me to reign." Now again, he's still bitter about this. He still thinks it belongs to him. However, the kingdom has turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. So he quickly covers that by saying, well, I recognize God chose him, but in my personal opinion, I don't think he really believes that. Verse 16, and now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me. She said to him, speak. He said, please ask King Solomon. He will not refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as wife. Bathsheba said, very well, I will speak for you to the king. Now you remember Abishag, we're introduced to her in the first 4 verses of 1 Kings chapter 1, that she is the young lady sought to come and take care of David as he is aging. Now, most likely she became a concubine, kind of a second-rate wife, and I hate to even speak in those terms, but that's where the sinfulness of man had led them to. And so Adonijah is asking for her in marriage. Now, it seems innocent on the surface, but if you understand history, Old Testament history, you understand there's something bigger going on here. You remember when Absalom, in his rebellion, you remember the advice that he took and then the deed that he did was that he set up a tent on the top of David's house, and he went into his father's concubines. It was a way of showing that he was now in control of all that his father had. And so he took his concubines to himself. And so whoever had control of those concubines, whoever had control of the previous king's wives and concubines, was then seen to be the next ruler. And so with requesting Abishag, it's an underhanded way for him to try and usurp the throne again by saying, well, look, I've got David's most recent concubine, and so I have a right to the throne because I possess her. Now, you remember this even in 2 Samuel 12, when Nathan has approached David about his sinfulness, and he tells David that I have given you the wives of your predecessor, of your enemy, of Saul, that they have come to you and you're in control of them. The implication is he's the king because he took over the previous king's wives, and honestly, that was one of the indicators. And so that's what's happening here. Now Bathsheba comes to Solomon. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah, and the king rose to meet her and bowed down to her, his obvious respect for his mother. Then he sat on his throne, and he had a seat brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right, a position of honor. And so he's wanting to honor her, and so he listening to her request. Then she said, I have one small request to make of you. Do not refuse me. And the king said to her, Make your request, my mother, for I will not refuse you. She said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as wife. King Solomon answered his mother, and why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Notice his wisdom here. When we get to the next chapter, next week in chapter 3, we're going to see his wisdom is multiplied, and he becomes world famous for it. But he's already showing wisdom here because he doesn't just explode immediately. He may have, I think he has a suspicion of what's going on. I think he knows that Adonijah is behind this, but he doesn't immediately jump to conclusions. He says, well, why do you think that? I mean, do you think he should just marry her like you're, for lack of a better term, making a love connection, or is there something deeper going on? She said, verse 22, King Solomon said to his mother, and why should she be given? Why should Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah. Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, God do so to me, and more also, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. He knows what Adonijah is up to. So why does he want to be given? Why does he want Abishag? Because he's trying to usurp the throne. And so he says, for this, he's going to die. Now, you remember at the end of chapter 1, what did he say? When he talked to Adonijah, he had every right at that moment to execute him. And he said, just go to your home. Don't create any more problems, and you'll be fine. Here he is again. He can't help himself. He's creating problems. And so Solomon said, that's it. He tried it once, and it failed, and I forgave it. The second time, this is a pattern. He's not going to change. He's not going to stop. He's got to die. He's got to be, because he's always going to be a thorn in the flesh. He's always going to be creating division in the kingdom, and it just can't happen. So he says, now therefore, as the Lord lives, who has established me and placed me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today. So King Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada and struck him down, and he died. Now again, this is not personal vengeance. That's not what he's seeking to do here. This is the solidification of the kingdom. This is treason and sedition. And treason and sedition in almost all nations is punishable by death. So here you have Solomon doing what, say, Romans 13 and verse 4 says government's right is to do. They don't bear the sword in vain. They can exercise capital punishment. And so Solomon is doing that. Then he moves a little bit further down the line, and he goes to Abiathar, the priest, you remember, that went with Adonijah's rebellion in chapter 1. Verse 26, and Abiathar, the priest, the king said, to Abiathar, the priest, the king said, go to Anathoth, to your estate, for you deserve death, but I will not at this time put you to death. So he basically forces him into retirement. He goes to Anathoth, which is a priestly city. Jeremiah the prophet is going to be from Anathoth a little bit later in Israelite history. So he tells him to go there and banishes him from his job. He says, but I will not at this point put you to death because you carry the ark of the Lord God before David my father, and because you shared in all my father's affliction. And so he's not going to put him to death because of who he is as a priest and the fact that he's borne the ark of the covenant of God, and because when David was fleeing from Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 23, and also in fleeing from Absalom in 2 Samuel chapter 15, Abiathar was faithful and good to his father. And so he said, for that reason, I'm going to spare your life. Even though you deserve death, I'm going to spare your life because of the way you treated my father. So Solomon expelled Abiathar from being priest of the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh. That is, a different family would take over. Zadok would take over. And we're going to see that here in just a little bit. But that's a reference to 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 27 through 36. Abiathar is a descendant of the house of Eli. You can look at 1 Samuel 14 and verse 2 in order to see some of those genealogical connections. So here are two individuals he's dealt with. One, he's Adonijah, his brother, has had to be put to death excuse me, for his unfaithfulness. Abiathar the priest has been banished and retired for his unfaithfulness. And now Joab gets wind of what's going on. Verse 28. And when news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, although he had not supported Absalom. That is, he didn't support Absalom's rebellion. He actually killed Absalom, 2 Samuel chapter 18, which was against David's wishes, which wasn't his best moment. But he did support Adonijah in his rebellion in 2 Kings or 1 Kings chapter 1. So Joab fled to the tent of the Lord, that is the tabernacle, and caught hold of the horns of the altar. There's a special significance, the asylum. And we saw this in the previous chapter when Adonijah clung to the horns of the altar. And so it was the common practice. Later, the Jews had their cities of refuge. They already had them, but sometimes they would just go ahead and flee to the horns of the altar. It was the same thing. Criminals could seek asylum in houses of worship or places of worship. And those horns of the altar were on the four corners of the altar of burnt offering. And so he's there holding on to it. As we said last week, saying maybe only God can judge me, or you wouldn't kill me here before the presence of God, so forth. Verse 29, and when it was told King Solomon that Joab has fled to the tent of the Lord, and behold, he is beside the altar, Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and saying, go strike him down. So Benaiah came to the tent of the Lord and said to him, the king commands, come out. But he said, no, I will die here. No, if you're going to kill me, you're going to have to kill me here. Then Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, thus said Joab, and thus he answered me. The king replied to him, do as he said, strike him down and bury him, and thus you will take away from me and from my father's house the guilt for the blood that Joab shed without cause. And so Benaiah, of course, is trying to be respectful and doesn't seem to be very comfortable with it on the front end. And so he goes back to Solomon, and Solomon said, it's his choice. I mean, this is going to happen, so it's his choice. Just do it. And thus that's the end of Joab. Now, again, if you read this without the lens of context of who Joab is, what he's done in the past, and the rightful role of Solomon as the king, you can see this as vengeance and just some people would call it brute barbarianism. But that's not what it is at all. This is meting out justice. And so, verse 32, the Lord will bring back his bloody deeds on his own head, because without the knowledge of my father David, he attacked and killed with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself. Abner, the son of Ner, commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa, the son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. So shall their blood come back on the head of Joab, the head of his descendants forever. But for David and his descendants, and for his house, and for his throne, there shall be peace with the Lord forevermore. That is, this is the sense of justice. The one who has committed the crime is now dead. My family, this throne, and the kings that will sit on this throne will not be held responsible for the actions of Joab, because we meted out justice. We made sure that the scales of justice were balanced, and the one who committed the crime paid the price. So, verse 34, then Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and struck him down and put him to death. And he buried him in his own house in the wilderness. Notice Solomon at least offers him that courtesy to bury him in his own house in that particular region. You can look at 2 Samuel 2 and verse 32. But what you really see here with Joab and his life is characterized in the words of Jesus. You remember in the garden when they're going to arrest Jesus, and Peter takes out his sword and cuts off the right ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, and Jesus tells him to put it up, Matthew 26:52, because those who take the sword, those who live by the sword or take the sword, will perish by the sword. And this was a man who had lived by the sword. He did not respect life. He was willing to take life in order to impose his own will. And when you live by the sword, you live that type of a life, it usually has a way of coming back around. And people who are involved in lives of crime, even to this very day, many of them have resigned themselves to the fact, I know that I'm not going to live a long life. I'm going to die. Someone is going to kill me. And that's just part of the life I've chosen. I've taken the lives of others, and they're going to take my life somewhere along the way. And so those who live by the sword die by the sword. When you embrace that kind of a lifestyle, it's inevitable that it comes back to you. So the king put Benaiah, verse 35, the son of Jehoiada, over the army in the place of Joab, and the king put Zadok the priest in the place of Abiathar. And so Benaiah becomes the chief general now that Joab is dead. And then Zadok takes the place of Abiathar as the new high priest, and he will stay in that position, and his family will stay in that position. Now, again, this is the fulfillment of the prophecy made to Eli and his house in 1 Samuel 2 that we mentioned, 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36. And he and his family, that is Zadok and his family, will stay in this position until the intertestament period at 171 BC, when the madman Antiochus IV Epiphanes replaces and corrupts the priesthood in Israel by making Menelaus of Benjamin the high priest, which of course you and I both know he has no right to serve as the high priest. He's not from the right tribe to begin with. Furthermore, he's not from the right family. And so this is a position that they will hold for all the rest of the days of Israel that we have recorded in sacred scripture, and even on up to the point of almost the New Testament, maybe about 170 years before the New Testament era begins. Verse 36. Then the king sent and summoned Shimei. This is the one who cursed David, and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there to any place whatever. For on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain that you shall die, and your own blood shall be on your head. And Shimei said to the king, what you say is good. As my lord the king has said, so will your servant do. So Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days. And so Shimei, he's not allowed to cross the Kidron, because that's in his ancestral home. That was his previous homeland. That's where in 2 Samuel 16, when David is fleeing from Absalom, he crosses the Kidron and goes up the Mount of Olives, and that's where he encounters Shimei. And so he's basically telling Shimei, you can't go home. You can live in Jerusalem. Now, this is something I did not realize prior to this study. And of course, there are a lot of those things. But this is one of them. I always thought of Jerusalem as this major metropolitan city at this particular time, but it actually isn't. Most people estimate it to have only been about 4,500 feet in circumference, about 11 acres, and really a population of maybe 2,500 people. Because you have to remember, it's only been in the control of Israel for 30 plus years at this point. Solomon's going to turn it into a pretty big city, of course. And during feast days, it's going to have a lot of people there. But it's not necessarily the biggest city in the world. So he's confining him. And so he's telling him, don't cross the Kidron, don't go home. But really what he means, the Kidron, means basically don't leave the city. It doesn't just mean you can't cross the Kidron Valley as long as you go back, as long as you go across a different valley, maybe the Hinnom Valley or something else along those lines. That doesn't matter. That's not his point. His point is you're going to stay in Jerusalem. I'm going to keep an eye on you and I'm going to watch you. You're not supposed to leave. That's the point. Well, that goes well for about 3 years. Verse 39. But it happened at the end of 3 years that 2 of Shimei's servants ran away to Achish, the son of Maacah, king of Gath. And Gath is one of the 5 lordship cities of the Philistines. It's located about 25 miles southwest of the city of Jerusalem. And so he has servants that flee. And it was when it was told Shimei, behold, your servants are in Gath. Shimei rose and saddled a donkey and went to Gath to Achish to seek his servants. Shimei went and brought his servants from Gath. But here's the problem. What has he done? He's broken his oath. Now, he might have thought in his mind, well, I'm not technically crossing the Kidron, like so many people would think, right? God lays down a law in Scripture, and we want to treat it like a technicality. Well, technically, I didn't go against it. Yes, you did. He said, don't cross the Kidron. His point was, don't leave Jerusalem. And Shimei may have thought, well, technically, I'm not crossing Kidron. I'm not crossing the Kidron. So what? You're leaving. Furthermore, it shows the fact that he didn't really respect the oath because, listen, if he had taken this oath seriously and his servants ran away, do you not think he could have at least gone to Solomon and said, look, this is the situation. I respect the oath that we made. Can I go get them or can we send somebody to go get them? This is Shimei's utter disrespect. He could have gone about this a completely different way. Okay. And furthermore, he's made an oath and he knows the rules of the oath. He knows he's going to die if he leaves the city. And so some people want to treat Solomon like he's some kind of a tyrant here. He's not. This man has already earned the death penalty for his blasphemy against King David. And now he's offering him a chance, and he is seditious. He's just as seditious as Adonijah is. And he's broken the parameters of the covenant. And as one writer put it, and I really appreciated the way he put it, he said, by breaking the oath to God and to Solomon, the old cursor of David has cursed himself. I think that's very good. By breaking the oath to God and to Solomon, the old cursor of David has now cursed himself. Now the curse of God will fall upon him. And so, verse 41, and when Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and returned, the king sent to him and summoned Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and solemnly warn you, saying, know for certain that on the day you go out and go to any place whatever, you shall die. And you said to me, what you say is good, I will obey. Why then have you not kept your oath to the Lord and to the commandment which I have commanded you? The king also said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the harm that you did to David my father. So the Lord will bring back your harm on your own head. And so Solomon understands. And you notice how Solomon says here that he told them that he was not to go out to any place whatsoever. And so that helps us to understand even further what he meant when he said, don't cross the Kidron. It meant nowhere. Don't leave the city. And so now the curse with which you hurled, the curse that you hurled at my father is like a boomerang. It's coming back around, and now it's going to land on your own head. And so, verse 45, but King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. You cursed my father and didn't want him to be king. But now, you're going to die. The curse of God is falling upon you. And my father lived and died as the king, and I'm his son, and our family line continues. And you will die under the curse of God, and we will live under the blessing of God. Verse 46, then the king commanded Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. Then the same phrase that ended the first section. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And so what we've seen is this first family succession. Saul was the first king, but we had a dynasty change. It went to a different family. And this is the first succession in this family. And so it has been successful. But it's also showing that the promises of God have been kept from 2 Samuel 7. The promise is underway. It is now transitioned from David to Solomon, and then we'll go from Solomon on to Rehoboam, and then on and on. It will go down through the centuries. So, Solomon is established as the king. Now, some people look at this, and I appreciate what one commentator did as he analyzed the chapter. What some people want to treat this like as if Solomon is out of step, as we've already mentioned, and that he is overstepping his bounds in what he's doing. But here's something we have to understand. Jesus is very much on his throne at this moment. And one day he's going to return. And he's going to mete out justice against those who have been seditious to his rule, the same way that Solomon did, and in a far greater way. There will be everlasting spiritual punishment for those who have been seditious to the reign of the one who came from this line, who sits on David's throne in heaven. His name is Jesus. And so God has chosen, just as Adonijah tried to usurp God's chosen in Solomon, people today are still trying to usurp God's chosen in Jesus Christ. And just as those who tried to usurp Solomon, God's chosen, they met the curse of God and they met a terrible fate. Those who try to usurp the throne and the chosen one of God, Jesus Christ, will meet a far more horrendous fate when he comes in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God nor obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. They're living in open rebellion to the lordship of Jesus. And so it's a chapter that we must think through, and not just, you see, I think it's convenient to put Solomon on trial and try and make him out to be a bad guy instead of seeing the chapter for what it really is, a foreshadowing of something that's far more terrifying that's yet to come. And that's not to be a fearmonger. It's simply to state reality, that Jesus is king. And one day we're going to be found on one side or the other, ones who submitted to him or ones who rebelled against him. And there are far greater consequences to the rebellion to Jesus than there were to rebellion against Solomon. That's something we always have to keep in mind.